Hi, it's Jenna Hansball, and we're going to look at the guitar part from the Interlude of Frank Zappa's Alien Orifice, as played by Steve Vai, who also features in this video a little bit later on. Alien Orifice appeared on the 1985 album Frank Zappa Meets the Mothers of Prevention. The piece has a beautiful melody, and at the time you could have said it harked back to the more romantic and delicate melodies from earlier on in Zappa's career. For the most part, the melody revolves around the A note. There are neighboring notes that decorate this, and there are a selection of chords that gravitate towards this A note centricity, although the A note is characteristically transformed depending on which chord it's played against. So in the first head, the A is played as a sharp 11 against the E flat Lydian. The chord then changes to a E minor 11, again with the A on top there. After the C Lydian chord, it goes to G minor 9, the A on top. So as you can hear, it's characteristic changes depending on what chord it's being played against. In the second head, the chords are a little bit different. So the chart that I'm going to be consulting in today's analysis is this. This I got back in 1991. I ordered it from Barfko, Swill. Going through some documents, I found this the other day. This actually came with the chart, and on the video, I ordered the dub room special on VHS as well. And this came with it, and it's a list basically of all the things that you could purchase from Barfko Swill back in the day. The most interesting sheet for me was this one, which has all the music, the scores and the charts for some of Zappa's really complicated music. Even back then in 1991, if you wanted the score to Sinister Footwear, that is the full orchestral score, it would have set you back $500. So some of these scores were quite expensive, and now they're really difficult to get hold of because you have to go through a publishing company. But it's quite nice that back in the day you could actually purchase these scores if you were really interested in the music. Also a list of the albums you could buy. There's the Old Masters box sets there, and some t-shirts and other types of merchandise if you were interested in that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's look at the guitar part and ways to approach the rhythms, and we'll also look at the technical considerations. If you know how to play it, you've learned it from the recording, well, that's a good accomplishment. It's not an easy thing to play, but I want to approach the analysis a little bit differently here. I'm going to let's say, wear the same cap that Steve Vai might have worn back in 1981 when he was given the guitar chart for the first time. You know, if we learn it from the recording, we have a reference. We can internalize the recording, we can play along to it. It's a little bit easier. But if you're faced with just the guitar chart and the notation, and there is no musical reference, you're on your own. You have to figure out what the rhythms are, how to play them on the guitar. So that's the kind of analysis I'm going to do today for this guitar part, this guitar interlude section here, is to assume the way Steve Vai might have played it back in 1981.
That little incident on the plane, I remember I was looking at it, getting very excited, trying to figure out how am I going to finger this, and running the rhythms in my head. And then as I'm sitting there looking at it, I'm like, how am I going to, okay, so on one occasion, I went up to the, first class, and I sat with Frank, and we reviewed it a little bit. And I said, what about this? And he looked at it, he said, and then he took it, and that's when he wrote those crazy septuplets. And, I thought, I should have stayed in my seat.
The beginning of the interlude is at bar 57. The first bar is straight ahead. It starts off with a semi-quaver, followed by a dotted quaver note that is tied to the first beat of a quaver note triplet in the second beat, and that's followed by 4 semiquavers. If I was looking at the chart, I would hone in on that first bar and play that to a metronome. I would just loop it over and over until I got comfortable with it. And in the next bar, you have an octuplet. That's 8 quavers played in the time of 6 quavers across 3 crotchets. Now, the acceleration and deceleration is quite salient here because in the bar 57, the first bar of the interlude, you have the triplet followed by the semiquavers, which gives a sense of acceleration, and then deceleration in bar 58 with the octuplet. Approaching the octuplet is merely a case of having your metronome and tapping out 8 notes across those 3 crotchets. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You just keep doing that, keep tapping it out, keep singing it in your head until you're familiar with it. Then play it on the guitar. It's pointless playing it on the guitar until you're comfortable with the actual rhythm there. Let's play that now. Let's just focus in on that one bar and loop that octuplet. You can get into a bit of a trance if you're playing steady rhythms, like in this case the octuplets, they've all got the same rhythmic value. The actual metronome starts to sound like it's going out of time. You're playing the octuplet and you got the reference of the metronome, and after a while the metronome sounds like it's irregular. It's quite an interesting phenomenon when you play these rhythms. I guess the next thing to do would put the 2 bars together. So bar 57, 58, and loop the 2 bars. When we get to bar 59, it's a series of semiquavers, so rhythmically doesn't present many problems. However, in bar 60, on beat 1, 4 semiquavers followed by a quaver note quintuplet played across beats 2 and 3. If I'm looking at this for the first time, the way I would approach that is I wouldn't worry about the semiquavers because they're easy enough, and just focus in on that quintuplet over the 2 beats. So I would have my metronome, let me just change this to 2 beats. Okay, we'll come back to that in a sec. And just try to hear the quintuplet over those 2 beats. I might sing it or tap it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, da 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 da. Okay, so I can hear that. I've got that in my head now. So the notes. You might notice that I'm actually playing the G sharp. So the first beat of the quintuplet that begins on beat 2 is a G sharp and it's tied to the previous note. But I'm playing it only so I can get familiar with the quintuplet. Eventually, I'll just leave it out and play it as written. But it just helps me get that reference there. Okay, I think I've got that. So now I'm going to play it as written. In the next bar, it's a quaver note triplet on the first beat, a crotchet, and then semiquavers. Again, rhythmically, okay. And then followed by another octuplet. So we should be familiar with the octuplet because we got that in bar 58 and again in 62, except with different notes. Okay, so let's try that over the metronome. Okay. From then on, it's just semiquavers. You have the rhythmically quite easy, but in terms of technique and the choice of notes, that's quite difficult, but we'll look at that in a minute. So when you land on that F, you've got a count of 3/4. This is good because this stabilizes things. You know, you've got the 3 bars of 5/16 and then 3/16, and then you stabilized for that bar of 3/4 before you continue with the next 5/16 and 9/16 bars. Two, three. 2, 3. In the following bars, you have a series of semiquavers. I had originally played it like this, but I couldn't quite get it up to speed comfortably. You know, it just sounded a bit messy when I was playing it at tempo. There's a lot of, if you look at my right hand, a lot of jumping around in that alternate picking style that it just feels really uncomfortable, and I just couldn't get it smooth enough. So I changed the position and I played it this way. Smoother, and I could get it up to speed. One thing Steve Vai mentioned in an interview we had a while back was, on hindsight, he thought that he could have played some of these parts using, you know, the pick and the finger.
Well, at the time I had this technique. My tone was not very good, but I could pick fast.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of picked more over the neck, towards the neck.
Right.
And I did this kind of thing. You can see it in some videos. Mm-hmm. It allows you to kind of do these intervallic skips relatively smoothly, but it doesn't have a great tone. Mm-hmm. And I abandoned that technique after I left Frank's, and I don't know if I could do what I wasn't doing at that time with Frank was using this finger to pick notes, mm-hmm. which would have changed everything. I wasn't hammering.
For the large intervallic leaps, you mean?
Yeah,
right.
It would have made it much easier. I just didn't consider it. I didn't use that technique.
You could do that. You could get and give you a bit more speed. But as he correctly noted, Zappa wanted every note clear, you know, hence his penchant for the vibraphone and marimba, instruments like that, where you can hear every note really clearly, which was probably very important for Zappa.
I wanted to play the melodies as they were written. So when you're reading guitar music, you don't slur unless there's a slur. And Frank didn't write a lot of slurs, you know, so it was all picked stuff. Mm-hmm. And he would not write guitaristically. He would just write melodies, you know, like he'd sit at the piano and he'd figure stuff out, write it down, and then give it to you. And you just had to figure out how to navigate the fretboard with it. So I would take the pieces of music he would give me and I'd have to work on them.
And then you have the octuplet again. The way I play the octuplet is like this. All within reasonable proximity. It's quite comfortable to play. But this is followed by a series of semiquavers in the next bar, followed by B flat, and then down to this C, finger roll on the F, A flat, B. When I first started playing it, I had a tendency to do this, almost sweeping it, and obviously that's not what's written in the chart. So I had to instill more control in the right hand, make sure that I was playing even semiquavers instead of that. So that takes a while, trying to get that steady right hand to make sure that you're playing the semiquavers correctly. See, I did it there. So you want da-da-da-da-da-da, get them all even. Now, the other navigational issue I had was was on the 5/16 bars, where it goes. Instead of playing it here, I chose to play it here. And when playing it at tempo, that worked out better. As you can see, the second incarnation is much easier to play. So what I'm doing here is I'm rolling across the C, F, A, and then going from the A to the B flat with the second to the third finger. And then the major 6 leap below, and then upper 5th of the D. You have to really do a delicate touch when you're doing the down sweep. It has to be a very light touch in the right hand. But then you find your right hand stiffening up to get those leaps. As I said in my Sinister Footwear 2 analysis of the guitar part of that piece, is that you have to change techniques at the most inopportune time. This is pretty much a mainstay for a lot of Frank Zappa's melodies that you have to play on the guitar. And that's one of them. So you kind of got a nice little sweep, reasonably comfortable. And then you get the note reiterations. And then the string skips. Just naturally, you'll kind of tense up a little bit to get the accuracy in the intervallic leap. And then the 7/16 bar at bar 72. You can see that I'm rolling my second finger. In order to get to that E in time. So that's pretty much it for the guitar interlude. Now I want to look at the chords. In some cases, the way these chords are written are quite idiosyncratic. Now I talked to Steve Vai about this.
When you look at something like Alien Orifice, the intricate chord symbol, I would assume that's because he's sitting at the piano and he's playing these chords, and then he's writing the melody, and then he's looking at the chord and what do I call this?
Yeah.
You know, and when it comes to calling a chord a name, boy, there's as many different opinions of how to do that as there are people that know what chords are. You know what I mean? When you start getting into the rules or the convention. And I did my best through the years because I always wanted to understand, and I wanted to be correct when I would write something and give it to a musician. You want that voicing a particular way, or you don't. You just want the flavor, and here's the chord. Do what you want with it. So when Frank did a lot of the melodic melody writing and then chord symbols, the symbol represented more of what the atmosphere of the chord's going to be. If Frank wanted a specific voicing, he wrote it out.
Yeah.
He said, play this, you know. And when it comes to the suffixes on a chord, like I said, I'm assuming that the way they're written was probably transcribed from the copyist directly as Frank wrote it.
Sure.
And because they're unconventional the way that he wrote them.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it might have been shorthand for him for actual voicings.
Right.
Because usually when you're stacking chord symbols, voicings, there's a particular order and they mean certain things. Like if you say, I think if you put a 13th in a chord, conventionally it means a major third, a flat seven, a nine, and the gray area is the 11th.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, if it's a 13th, it has to have an 11. And if it has an 11, then that's the sus on the 4.
Yeah.
So there's so many ways, and you'll never know until unless you can go to Frank and say, what do you mean by this? Because it's totally unconventional and confusing.
Sure.
Okay. It leaves guys like us trying to figure out what he meant.
While we're talking about the chords, as in Mogio, the Mogio chart and the Alien Orifice chart, there are chords written out, but in the recordings, you don't hear the chords, you just hear the melodies. In my Mogio video, I actually recorded a section with the chords that were written in the chart and played the melody on top, just out of interest, just out of curiosity, really. And it sounded nice. It sounded quite obvious. And I kind of have the feeling that if the chords were recorded, that during maybe the mixing stage or even the rehearsal stage, Zappa thought, you know what, it's too obvious. I don't want those chords in there. Let's just take them out and just have the melody there. It creates more ambiguity, more intrigue. It certainly does that. And the same thing has happened here. Obviously, the chords are there for the melody, the first head and the second head. But during the interlude and the section that follows that, as you can see, there are chords there, but they're not sounded in the recording. Anyway, like I did with Mogio, I recorded this section and put the chords in with the melody just to see what it sounded like. So I'm going to share that with you now. So I'm not sure if you'd agree with me, but I think it sounds a lot better without the chords. I like the idea that it's ambiguous and it has a sense of urgency. It's quite an intense section of the music here, but really it's essentially made up of one-bar melodic phrases that are modified and transformed throughout the section there. And we're going to run through that. I'm not so interested in the technique and playing it up the tempo at this point. I just want to run through the melodies and just show you how skilled Zappa was at recycling musical material. What I want to do is take it from bar 77. At this bar, the first 4 notes are... Now this is like a 4-note cell that you hear in Zappa's non-diatonic music a lot. The other one he does in the following bar is... That's another cell that gets used a lot. You may recognize it from the opening melody of Sinister Footwear, the orchestral version. But this, it's a chromatic cell, but it's varied in many different ways. These are self-contained melodic phrases, one-bar phrases that become transformed throughout the section. So bar 77, and almost like a call and response there. The next 2 bars really support the analysis in terms of these one-bar melodic phrases. It's very obvious that it's happening in these 2 bars. From 77 again. Really interesting. Focusing in on bar 79, have a C2, which is a C sus2 chord there. This is a really good example of the idea of having these neutral chords which can support notes from the scales that can be either major, minor. So there's a C sus2, and then it's a da da ba da 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 ba. If you were to look at it diatonically, you're getting quite a few interesting notes there. Flat 7, major 7, minor 3rd, sharp 4. This was a very important chord for Frank Zappa, and because it allowed him to color the chord with so many possibilities.
The chord has no third in it. That means the pitch of the chord, which determines whether it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished, is missing. All you have is the root, the second, and the fifth. When you have those three intervals in there, you still hear it as a chord, but the notes that you can play against it enable you to encompass all the different variations of the nature of the chord. You can play major thirds, minor thirds, and everything in between against that chord. It's more like a neutral piece of canvas that you can paint on.
At bar 84, you may recognize that as being the very first bar at the beginning of the interlude. And it's appearing here again, but with different rhythms. The notes are exactly the same for those two bars, but the rhythm has changed. This is a technique called isomalism. From bar 84, I just wanted to point one thing out here. So I've made a few little notes. Copying errors occur. So if you have this chart and you're looking at the notes and you're playing along to the recording, there's a mistake here at bar 85. There's a D sharp there, but in the recording it's actually C sharp, and that would collude with the C sharp in the interlude section. It's definitely a C sharp because I've listened to the recording and I can hear the tune percussion and Tommy Mars's keyboards there. They're definitely hitting the C sharp. When they get to the C note, this is in the recording, when that C note happens, Ed Mann is playing the C and Tommy Mars is playing an A, so they're minor third apart. I don't know why that is. I don't know whether that was a kind of instruction given during the recording process, but there are two notes there. All the other notes are unison. They're playing exactly the same notes, but for some reason, this last note here is a C in the tune percussion and an A in the keyboards. And this line continues here, and then we get to this bar. Again, a copying error, C to B. That's not in the recording. That's a B and an A. So there were a few discrepancies there. I'll just point them out in case any of you look into it in that kind of depth, and you might be questioning why these notes are different to the recordings. But it's a really clever way of building tension at that point. You have a repeated phrase. It's really building the tension. When we get to the next page, it starts to go into these little rhythmic cells of 3/8, 5/16. And the way the melody changes becomes quite disorientated, but it's a really clever way of building tension until we get back to the head again, the second head, the melody. So there's some really interesting phrases there, and as I said, it's simply one-bar melodic phrases that are repeated throughout. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful, and in the words of Steve Vai, don't hurt yourself, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.